Vanakkam. Welcome to this course on classics in neuroscience. We have been looking at learning and memory. In the last couple of videos, we looked at the contributions of Carl Lashley and Donald Hebb. We continue our discussion in this class with the limbic circuit or the limbic lobe. Although much of the work in the 1940s and 1950s was focused entirely on the cortex and cortical function and cortical columns, cortical processing, there was some interest in understanding lower level circuitry. Along with the other advances, the 1950s also had some advances in the limbic system, specifically in the identification of the hippocampus and amygdala and their functional role in the limbic system. So, this was recognized only in the 1950s. So, in this video, we will look at the limbic lobe and we will describe briefly about the Papez circuit. As I mentioned, among the great advances of the 1950s were also the recognition of the importance of the limbic system and the evidence for the functional role of hippocampus and amygdala within the limbic system. Paul Broca in 1878 was the first to suggest that the limbic lobe is essentially a ring like this, that which is shown in pink here is a ring formed by the cingulate gyrus, which is a ring of the cerebral cortex, the hippocampus, the encircling central core of the forebrain. This is essentially at the exit and at the entry of the cerebral hemisphere, which is why the name limbic is given, because it is close to the entry and exit, or more like a door. Limbic has the meaning that it is close to an entrance or an exit. It was believed that the limbic lobe is perhaps the seat of lower faculties, whereas the higher faculties were seated in the cerebral cortex. But what do you mean by lower faculties and higher faculties? Lower means things such as feelings, emotions, whereas higher faculties would involve thinking, ideas, conceptualizing, visualizing, imagining, or may also be rationalizing and other such things, are perhaps part of the cortex here, whereas the emotions were restricted to this lower region, is the limbic lobe, whereas the emotions and feelings are perhaps restricted to the lower region, also the seat of these lower faculties, which is the limbic lobe. So, this whole field of the study of emotions and the limbic lobe was revolutionized by the ideas of James Papez, who studied the emotional outbursts in patients who had damage to the hippocampus and the cingulate gyrus. He wanted to reassess our anatomical understanding, or what may be the anatomical reasons for these emotional outbursts. So, he was keen on reassessing the anatomical relations between these emotional outbursts and the changes in the anatomy essentially. So, again coming back to an old theme that we keep discussing, we are always interested in the structure function relationships or the anatomy physiology relationships. So, Papez was keen on identifying what may be the reason for these emotional outbursts. So, he proposed a novel hypothesis for the mechanism of emotion. He called as a proposed mechanism of emotion. According to this scheme, according to this idea, this mechanism, emotional expression essentially arose from the hypothalamus deep within the core of the brain. Somewhere here deep in the core of the brain is hypothalamus. Through projections to the brainstem which controlled the motor output, and which are the muscles and the glands that are responsible for emotional expression. That is okay. So, this is essentially an emotional expression, but how did the rest of the brain know about this output? This was conveyed by the mammillary bodies of the hypothalamus to the thalamus, and from the thalamus to the cingulate gyrus. So, from the thalamus to the cingulate gyrus, and then through the cingulum to the hippocampus. So, remember, the cingulate gyrus is perhaps the center for subjective interpretation of the emotional state. So, essentially the seat of the subjective interpretation or the individual experience of that emotion. Then the cingulate gyrus connected with the hippocampus, and the hippocampus essentially combined the information coming from the cingulate gyrus with the inputs that it is also receiving from various other regions of the brain, other parts of the brain, and sent this emotional output back to the mammillary bodies. So, the loop is completed. So, there is a parahippocampal system, and then from the hippocampus through the fornix, the information comes back to the mammillary bodies. Remember, the original input to the cingulate gyrus comes from thalamus, which in turn received it from the mammillary bodies. So, this loop is now complete with the information going from subiculum in the hippocampus to the mammillary bodies. There is a difference. One is the emotional response that is given, the other is the combined effect of the emotional response versus also the other inputs, sensory inputs and other inputs that are being received from other parts of the brain. So, what is received by the mammillary bodies from the hippocampus is not the same like what is received from the hypothalamus. These are two different things, because what is received from the hippocampus is processed information. So, this loop constituted the so called limbic system or the Papez circuit of the limbic system. So, until the Papez scheme was introduced, hippocampus was considered to be a part of the rhinencephalon or the nose brain. RHI rhinencephalon or the nose brain, a part of the cortex or a part of the brain that is responsible for olfactory function. For a long time it was believed that hippocampus was somehow having some unknown function related to the olfaction or the sense of smell or the nose brain. It formed part of the nose brain. Only it was James Papez and his scheme that gave a functional role to the hippocampus in the subjective experience of emotion. With this, we come to the end of this video. In this video, we introduced the notion of the limbic lobe, and we described briefly the work of James Papez and his proposal. Papez called his contribution as a proposed mechanism of emotion. This idea completely revolutionized the study of emotions and the neural basis of emotion. With this, we come to the end of this video. Thanks for your attention.